Hello everyone. With this last video, we will end our course on the Introduction to Literature by looking at the phenomenon of reading. Now, a number of scholars have looked at what happens to the human mind when a person reads a text. For this class, I assigned an essay by Wolfgang Iser. Now, Iser was born in Marienburg, Germany, and is considered a postmodern scholar. Now, the study of what happens to the human mind when one reads is not easy, as you probably noticed as you read the essay. It is difficult language. So I want us to start with one of the terms, which was concretization. To start, let's look at what a text is and how it is created. First off, there is the artistic half of a text, and that is the physical creation of a text. By that I mean when someone sits down and types or writes a story. But as we've already discussed in this class, a text that is simply typed doesn't really exist. It's simply a collection of symbols and ink on paper. So the second half of a text and its existence is the aesthetic, and that is the physical act of reading the text. So as you can see, it takes two people at least to make a literary text exist. You need the artist who is willing to craft the story out of words and to make it a physical document. And you need a reader to physically sit down and read the text. Now, because it takes those two, the text has to concrete itself. It has to build itself in order to exist. But when it exists, it doesn't exist as a physical space. It exists in what Iser calls a virtual space. So think of it this way. There is a second form of any literary text, and it is a non-physical existence that almost floats on top of a book. Next, let's talk about how this non-physical existence of a book is built. Now, one of the first things that's needed is the reader's imagination. So, for example, if you have a description in the text that reads, "The young woman wore a red cloak, one long enough to stop just behind her knees." There is enough information here to tell you certain details. You know the rough age of the character, you know the sex of the character. You know the type of clothing the character is wearing. That includes its size as well as its color. But the rest of the information is missing. So you don't really know a lot about this character, and you will have to provide that information with your imagination. Now, this is where the artistic side of the text comes into play. We as critics can look at the amount of information that the artist provides in the text. For example, she ran her right hand through her long, straight blonde hair cut shoulder length, and she brushed those strands behind her ear, just as her mother had done when she was 18 years old also. Her ruby ring, a circular cut facet attached to a simple gold band, flashed in the light of the overhead street light. She stopped to sip her coffee. And that's all she wrote, because we, as readers, have already fallen asleep. It's boring. When an artist provides too much information, and when an artist makes the text too restrictive, then the reader cannot provide the missing information with his or her imagination. The text loses its ability to engage the reader. There's too much of the artist and not enough of the aesthetic. The same is true with the other extreme. If the artist does not provide the reader with enough information to begin building an imaginary picture, once again, we get bored, we fall asleep, we walk away from the text, we don't engage with it. So, for this concept of concretization, this is the process by which the author creates the text and the reader reads and engages in the text, filling all of the missing spaces with his or her imagination. This creates the virtual text. So the key here is engagement. You have to get the reader engaged in the text, which means the other key that we have to watch for is boredom. If the text is too boring, then the reader will not engage and the book will not exist. This is why Esser describes the text as like an arena in which reader and author participate in a game of the imagination. Now, this is on the first page of your handout. So, imagine a literary text as two puzzle pieces. The first puzzle piece is the artist creation. The second puzzle piece is the reader's imagination, and the two pieces have to come together in order to make a literary text happen. Now let's look at some of the things that happen when these two pieces come together. So Esser writes that the literary text acts as a kind of mirror. So let's think about how this works. Remember earlier we discussed that if the artist has created the text well, the artist has left these gaps that the reader has to fill in with the reader's imagination. That means the reader is giving himself or herself into the text, which means the text is showing or revealing to the reader those aspects of himself. It has to make sense. There's no one else who's providing that imagination, and that imagination has to come from the reader's past experiences, the reader's history, the events that the reader's gone through himself or herself. But remember that the artist has created the other half. The artist has created a particular story that the reader has to participate in. So Esser writes, the reality which this process helps to create is one that will be different from the reader's. So the text is still going to be different from the reader's life or expectations. It is not the same story that the reader has lived. It is simply fleshed out by parts of the reader's imagination. So there's two things that are happening here. The text acts as a kind of mirror because it reflects part of the reader's life, so the text seems familiar, but at the same time it is involving the reader in a reality that is not the reader's reality. It's the artist's reality. So think of it this way. One of the main plot points in the Harry Potter series is that Harry Potter is an orphan. His mother and father have died. Now, if you are a reader whose parents are still alive, this is not familiar territory to you. This is not a part of your reality. So you're going to experience something that is a part of the artist's reality, but not your own. At the same time, it is a stricture of the text. You as a reader cannot simply say, well, I dismiss that part of the story and I'm just going to keep reading and imagine that Harry Potter's parents are still alive. because the text will continue to come back to you and say again and again that this is the situation. This character does not have parents. So you as a reader can't just simply say, this is my choice. I've decided that the plot point is this, because the text will resist. But as we already saw, if the artist makes the text too resistant, meaning all the details are very restricted, then the reader's imagination can't become involved in the text. The reader gets bored. The reader leaves the text does not exist. So for concretization, you've got to have these two separate sides coming together to make a text exist. Easter uses the analogy of a constellation. It is the artist's responsibility to place the stars in the sky in a fixed position that will resist any sense of change. It is the reader's responsibility to draw the lines between the stars to make a shape occur. What shape that is drawn is up to the reader's imagination. Now, Easter has looked at this notion of concretization. What happens in a text to make a text become real, and talking about that virtual reality that's in a text, which is caused by the author's creation and the reader's imagination coming together. Let's also look at this other idea known as entanglement. Now, hopefully all of you have experienced this event, but if not, let me introduce this idea to you. It is entirely possible for a person to get lost inside a book. Now, you probably have heard that phrase. What this means is that your attention becomes so focused on your imaginary experience within the text by your pushing of your imagination to fill out all of the empty spaces that you lose track of time. You simply become lost inside the reality of the text. And the reality that is around you seems to disappear. You don't notice that you're in a room reading a book. The only existence is that book. Reading scholars describe that process or event as losing a sense of one's self. Your sense of self recedes into the background, and this new sense of self exists only in the imagination. When this occurs, the individual actually feels a sensation of pleasure, as all of the hormones that are related to pleasure and accomplishment and love and fulfillment start churning within the body. So yes, you can actually feel physical pleasure, serenity, and happiness by reading a literary text. So let's talk about what happens to trigger this sense of pleasure and happiness from reading a book. So Easter begins by saying that the text becomes the present. The text becomes what is real. The reader's own ideas fade into the past. By this he means your presence within the physical world disappears. Your brain shuts off all of the external stimuli that it's receiving. So all the information that your brain is receiving that says, I'm sitting in a room, I'm sitting in a chair, I've got a cup of coffee, I have a book in my hand, I've got a cat in my lap, all of that information is no longer registered. The information that is registered will be all of the details that are in the book. So if a book is well written and it has site description details and sound and smell and taste details, then those are going to be the physical stimuli that the brain will process and not the stuff that's actually happening inside the room. And this is what is meant by entanglement. The brain has become entangled in the literary text. The brain has disconnected from physical reality. And why would people want to disconnect from an authentic physical reality? Is because the brain and the body, quite frankly, feel pleasure. It feels physically good to do this. Now let's look at another event that happens when one is reading, and that is known as identification. Now, Easter begins this part of his essay by looking at a quotation by George William Clark from 1864 about the book Jane Eyre. We took up Jane Eyre one winter's evening, somewhat piqued at the extravagant commendations we had heard. But as we read on, we forgot both commendations and criticisms, identified ourselves with Jane and all her troubles, and finally married Mr. Rochester about 4 in the morning. Now, let's look at this notion of identified ourselves with Jane. It's more than that Jane Eyre is a relatable character. It's that the sense of self with the reader has become one with the sense of self of Jane Eyre. You have become Jane Eyre, and you marry Mr. Rochester at the end of the book. So let's look at how this happens when one reads certain text. This certainly does not happen with all literary text. Here are the first 2 paragraphs of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. We had been wandering indeed in the leafless shrubbery an hour in the morning, but since dinner, Mrs. Reed, when there was no company, dined early, the cold winter wind had brought with it clouds so somber and a rain so penetrating that further outdoor exercise was now out of the question. I was glad of it. I never liked long walks, especially on chilly afternoons. Dreadful to me was the coming home in the raw twilight with nipped fingers and toes, and a heart saddened by the chidings of Bessie, the nurse, and humbled by the consciousness of my physical inferiority to Eliza, John, and Georgiana Reed. What we have here is a first-person narrator. We have an I voice. And as we've seen before when we were looking at Jacques Lacan's work, this notion of the pronoun I becomes very confusing when a person reads. Who is the I voice? Is it the character or is it the reader? Now for Easter, the event that we literary scholars should be aware of is this notion of who is thinking. Going back to one of the sentences from Jane Eyre, I was glad of it. I never liked long walks, especially on chilly afternoons. So who is this person that is thinking? Is it the author, Charlotte Bronte, who is thinking? The answer to that is an obvious and easy no. Charlotte Bronte's been dead. She's been dead for quite some time. Is it the reader who is thinking? Surprisingly, it is not you who is thinking, because unless you have access to a time machine and can go back into the 1800s and do some drastic surgery on your age, physical size, sex, and change your gender, then no, you cannot be Jane Eyre. Esser writes this. This would mean that consciousness forms the point at which author and reader converge. And at the same time, it would result in the cessation of the temporary self-alienation that occurs to the reader when his consciousness brings to life the ideas formulated by the author. Now, this is confusing text, but what this means is that a new form of consciousness arises, at which point the author and the reader converge in the text, when the two of them come together to form this virtual Jane Eyre who is doing the thinking. The self of the reader goes away, and the reader provides the energy to make the self of Jane Eyre appear and become real. Now, one of the critiques of a good literary text is that the life story of the author must be shut out of the work. In other words, the author has to be of a good craftsman to place himself or herself out of the story and to let the story create a new self. Next, the individual disposition of the reader has to be shut out. So in other words, you as the reader have to lose yourself in the text. You have to become entangled to such an extent that your sense of self dissipates and shifts and moves into the background. Now, this is the part that I find really fascinating about the phenomenon of reading. It follows that the work itself must be thought of as a consciousness, because only in this way is there an adequate basis for the author-reader relationship, a relationship that can only come about through the negation of the author's own life story and the reader's own disposition. The reader has to disappear, the author has to disappear, and the reader has to create this new consciousness of Jane Eyre. That means that whenever you read a text and whenever you get lost in a text and you feel pleasure from reading a text, you have created a new being that thinks for itself. Now, ethically, what is our responsibility to this new form of life? So let's look at this. In thinking the thoughts of another, the reader's own individuality temporarily recedes into the background since it is supplanted by these alien thoughts, which now become the theme on which his attention is focused. As we read, there occurs an artificial division of our own personality because we take as a theme for ourselves something that we are not. So identification is more than just that the character is relatable. You, the reader, become the character. You project yourself into the text. You become Jane Eyre. Now, this is especially easy for first-person narrators because you've got the I voice, but it also works for third-person narrators that are limited, where you as the reader have access to only one character's thoughts. Then you can project yourself into that character. You become that character becomes alive, and you experience the life of that character. Now, Esser points out that sometimes this can be really fascinating when the narrator is an unreliable narrator. As a review, an unreliable narrator is a first-person narrator that intentionally tries to mislead the audience. or is not capable of understanding the events in the story accurately. When a person reads a well-written, unreliable narrator, and when the reader becomes entangled and identifies with the unreliable narrator, we, the readers, are actually the ones who are unreliable. We are the ones who are intentionally trying to mislead ourselves. Or we are the ones who are completely misunderstanding the events of the story. And this is a really fascinating idea to pause and think about. It's also important to pause and think about the very fact that a book isn't just a physical collection of paper. It is an object that allows a person to channel his or her life energy, his or her thoughts, to create a new form of consciousness, a new form of being that exists only when it is being read. For example, you are not Charlotte Bronte, she's dead. You're not Jane Eyre, you can't be Jane Eyre. And at the same time, you are not yourself when you read that text. The text literally becomes alive. Now let's take a brief sidebar and think about movies and cinema. The phenomenon that happens when one reads and the identification with characters only happens with physical text. It does not happen with cinema. Now, this is because there's no engagement in the imagination in cinema. Notice, if you are reading Harry Potter, there is no physical depiction of the main characters. You have to decide, what do these characters really look like? How do they work? And you're reading and experiencing the thoughts of these characters, and you're providing them the life energy that's needed for them to exist. But when you watch the film, you are simply a spectator. You are a witness to the events as they pass through. Now you can't decide if Harry Potter has long hair or short hair, or if Hermione Granger has blonde hair or red hair or black hair. All of these things are decided for you because you're simply witnessing the event. You are not projecting your sense of self into the character. You're not becoming these characters. So film and cinema doesn't have the same phenomenon that reading does. Now, this particular module that we are working on this week is about social action and how text can be used to improve the world. Let's look at one last thing that happens when one reads a text, and that is wish formulation. Here, Easter brings in the work of D.W. Harding, who says, fictions contribute to defining the reader's or spectator's values and perhaps his desires, rather than to suppose that they gratify desires. In other words, reading doesn't fulfill our wish fulfillment. It doesn't fulfill the needs that we personally have as readers. Instead, we project into one of the characters, we become that character, and we adopt the wishes of that character. Those character wishes replace our own wishes. So for example, when we read Jane Eyre, we as readers don't come into the book needing a marriage or falling in love with a dark gentleman with a seedy past. These things develop within us as readers as we read them. We become Jane Eyre. We experience the pain and the joy of her life, and Our desires are supplanted and replaced by her needs and desires. Literary texts, therefore, are one of the best ways to get a person to understand what is happening in another person's life, what those troubles are. So let's look at texts like this. Let's start with Uncle Tom's Cabin. Here was an opportunity for readers to physically, mentally be a slave and understand the trials and tribulations of being a slave. When people read this text, they understood better the suffering of those who were enslaved, and this helped society in the United States in the 1800s come to grips with the notion of slavery and the need for abolition. In a similar fashion, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle allows readers to understand what it is like to be completely exploited, to mean that your job takes over everything about your life, that your employers have no concern for your safety, and it becomes a matter of survival. George Orwell's 1984 allows a reader to experience the oppression of a totalitarian society. If you were thinking that it might not be so bad, here is an opportunity to educate readers in understanding just how awful it will be to live in a society that is that totalitarian. Our last example, Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. Here, Atwood has created a realm in which women have absolutely no civil rights. Now, think about it. If a man were to read this text, he would understand in truth, because he had become a female character who was experiencing this oppression. When he left that text, he would have a better understanding of why a misogynistic society is so awful. Now, notice how powerful this tool is. Often, literature is seen as some frivolous entertainment, but it doesn't have to be that way. Through the power of reading, through the phenomenon of reading, if you wish to become the artist who creates the other half of the puzzle, then you can actually create agents of social change. Now, at the same time, remember that this type of text can also affect you. So, be careful with what you consume, because what you consume turns you into that character. Do you really want to become a young girl who is learning how to be a good wife to a physically abusive older man who at any moment could kill her? Is that the kind of person that you want to be? Or do you want to be the kind of person that says, look, I am not taking any kind of physical abuse? Wolfgang Iser's essay is one of those essays that changed my life when I read it in the 1980s as a student. It showed me that literary texts aren't frivolous. They're not some empty waste of time. They can be used to radically change the world for the better. At the same time, they showed me that empty reading without bothering to see what the text means and what it will do, can also be a dangerous aspect. If any of you wish to become those artists, if after this class you've looked at these texts and you want to be the crafters who make the next generation of literary text, remember that your goal is to simply create half a text. The text has to have enough empty space that the reader can project his or her imagination. In doing so, you can entangle the reader and you can allow this sense of identification to happen. And this concludes our course on the Introduction to Literature. It has been a joy and a pleasure to note that you have followed us along on this journey, and I hope that you've seen enough types of texts, you've enjoyed your wine tasting course, and you know which text you like to read, which text you don't, so that you can experience the actual physical joy of reading that we've learned about in this video lesson.